Welcome to everyone here for our 2023 John C. Rouman Lecture, the fall lecture, our signature lecture on campus. I'm Scott Smith. I'm professor of classics. I'm the chair of the Classics, Humanities, and Italian Studies department, and I'm a proud member of the John C. Rouman Lecture Series board, and we all welcome you to our event. We have a giant of the field here tonight, and we're very excited. The John C. Rouman Lecture Series Board was founded in 1998 by the generosity of two donors who I'll name later, and for 25 years now it has been doing amazing things at UNH and throughout the state. We have brought many lectures. You can peruse them in your program in the center since 1998. And in addition, we've also been able to fund student study abroad and also some other functions as well. So we could not be more proud of what the John C. Rouman Lecture Series Board has done. The honorandus for the series, John C. Rouman, was a dear friend of mine who passed in August. And we're very excited that we can have his legacy live on continuously through this lecture series and through other things that we're doing. And we're very proud of what the board has accomplished. John C. Rouman was a faculty member here for over 40 years, and it is not an overstatement to say that he was the bedrock of what we founded here and what we're continuing to do. John C. Rouman was a legend. Not only did he teach countless students, he was a mentor to a fraternity, and those students still speak with great admiration for him. They helped dig his car out of the snow in the winters. This is the kind of achievement that I'm trying to achieve in my own life. Not quite gotten there yet. But John was an esteemed member of our society. And he also, for example, founded a very important John C. Rouman scholarship that helps students who take Latin and Greek be able to continue their studies. So he's nothing short of amazing. It is with great pleasure then that I am here to acknowledge a couple of different very important people. In particular, John Rouman's brother. Jim Rouman is here. Please give me a round of applause, Jim. Jim Rouman is, in his own right, an amazing human being. I look over the fact that he is a Yankees fan. I'm a Red Sox fan. But he has been no less of a bedrock support for our program over the years as well. We could not be happier to have him here tonight. He's just gotten back from a multi-week trip in Greece, so his presence here is all the more remarkable, and hopefully he will regale us with all kinds of stories. We also have other really important members. I'll point out that we have the former Secretary of State of the state of New Hampshire, Bill Gardner, the Honorable Bill Gardner, who is here. Bill, will you raise your hand and be recognized? And John Rouman's colleague for 40 years, Father Konstan, who is also here as well. So, Father Konstan, good to see you back here as well. Thank you for coming. So John's legacy also spreads out in a number of other ways, and we have many of his former students who were both colleagues and also really important teachers of classics in the region. So I just want to point out a few. I want to point out Richard Claremont. Will you please raise your hand? Richard, who retired last year. We miss his presence every day. We have Selma Nakash-Hoff here, who graduated a few years ago. And Paul Perpertio, also one of John Rouman's early students. So Paul, great to have you here as well. Thank you. This series would not be possible without the incredible support and generosity of our donors, Christos and Mary Papuzzi. I know that they are not very fond of the publicity, but I just want to acknowledge with heartfelt thanks all that you've done for 25 years. You have made this very possible. You've also made it possible for classics here to thrive. I've been doing some reviews of other colleges, and their classics programs are doing well. I can be quite confident to say that the University of New Hampshire classics program is doing very well nationally. And it's in part because of the support we have from important people like Christos and Mary, who allow us to do great things for our students, including bringing this wonderful speaker here tonight. So please, thank you from the bottom of my heart. I would love to be able to speak about our speaker, but we actually have one of his former students in the audience, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Paul Robertson, who will be giving that introduction. With the weird microphone.
This is fantastic. So hello, good evening. Thanks everybody for being here. So typically in a talk of this type, it is very customary where you run through their appointments and their accomplishments and all of their various deeds and great things of this nature, but David Konstan is not that sort of fellow who really desires accolades, I think. I'm not going to mention really the over 24 editorial positions. You know, we shouldn't really have much discussion of the several dozen books he's published. You know, we'll keep scarce discussion also of the hundreds of articles that he's written. We're also not at all going to mention, of course, the fact that he has had hundreds of students, undergraduate, graduate. His illustrious career will go completely unmentioned with regard to his classics professorship at NYU and Brown University simultaneously. I didn't know that was possible, but there it was, and it was done. But instead of mentioning any of that, I want to tell a brief story. I was David Konstan's graduate student, one of his graduate students while at Brown. And I was going on the job market, and I asked David for kind of a story. I said, how does this work? What happens? You're writing me a letter. I talk to some people. They give me a job, ? And he sits me down at lunch, and he says, Paul, and he's from New York, and so he's very direct, which I've always liked. And he said, I'm going to explain to you how this works. I write them letters that say, you should talk to this guy. And then once you have a meeting with him in the interview, you be fantastic. And that was the end of the conversation. That was the extent of his advice. No sort of careful, gentle mentorship. No, it was, I write him a letter that says, talk to this guy, and you be fantastic. Full stop. I'll see you next week or whenever. And I thought about this a lot, that that's really the goal. That's really what you have to do. And he was not really talking, there's not a strategy, there's no corner cutting. There's no way that you can kind of get around it or through it. There's no secret sauce. You basically have to wake up every day and try and be fantastic. In every interaction with every other human being, you should be fantastic. Every time you write an article, it should be fantastic. Every time you read something, it should be fantastic. Every time you go and join a department, it should be fantastic. Every time you go and be a colleague or a friend or a human being, be fantastic. And that straightforwardness of the advice has stuck with me. And suffice to say, David's life and his career has been fantastic. We are all fantastically blessed to have you here today, David. So everybody, please welcome David Konstan.
Well, thank you so much, Paul. Can I be heard everywhere in the room? Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you, Scott. Thank you for the invitation to be here. It is a great honor. I had the privilege of knowing John Rouman, now to have met his brother here as well, especially gratifying. This is not my first time at this campus. It's several times. Last time, just a few years ago, for a beautiful conference on mythography organized by Scott and Stephen, and just recently came out as a book. So it's a real honor for me to be here. Now, I'm going to talk about some serious stuff. It won't be as funny as I like. I'm only hoping that it isn't characterized as being especially appropriate for a building called Merkland. A little scary. I don't want to be the figure that gives that building its legitimate name. So maybe it won't be as murky as I fear. So let's start. Xenophon was an Athenian and a contemporary of Plato. But although he was, like Plato, a great admirer of Socrates, and he wrote Socratic dialogues, his name is not nearly as familiar to the general public. He was also a historian, and he wrote a sequel to Thucydides' great work, and yet again, he's almost wholly overshadowed by his predecessor, Thucydides. He was, in addition, a distinguished soldier who led 10,000 Greek mercenaries out of Persia and back to Greece when the expedition for which they were hired was aborted. But who would compare him with Alexander the Great, who always carried a copy of Xenophon's memoir in his pocket during his exploits when he was on campaign? Recently, however, there has been a surge of interest in this fascinating and multifaceted figure. It's a fascinating figure. A couple of years ago, even saw the founding of an international Xenophon society, only a couple of years ago. And by the way, membership is free. Look it up, register, and you're in. Xenophon lived through a turbulent period in Athens history, during which the democracy was overthrown twice, although only for a short duration, and Athens was defeated by Sparta and its allies in the decades-long Peloponnesian War. Xenophon himself was exiled in the aftermath of the war. The details are obscure, and he lived for a long while on an estate that was granted to him by the Spartans. He thus had ample experience of conflict, both among Greek cities and inside them, where partisans of democracy and of oligarchy engaged in brutal battles for control, sometimes exterminating the enemy entirely, who were their fellow citizens. He was intensely aware of the costs of such polarization among fellow citizens, and he developed, as I hope to show, a political outlook supported by philosophical reflection as a disciple of Socrates that sought to reduce such antagonisms by encouraging mutual understanding. For all his commitment to compromise, alas, Xenophon was aware of how ineffective it was in reconciling parties driven by passion and stubborn ideologies. So this is what I am crediting Xenophon with seeing, both in his experience and having thought it through enough to apply Socratic wisdom to this theme. So let's see. So let's begin. In 406 BC, just 2 years before a small and vicious oligarchy took power in Athens, and Athens finally surrendered to Sparta, just 2 years before this, there took place a naval encounter between two warring alliances, Athens and the Spartans. And Athens defeated Sparta. It was, in fact, the Spartans were moved to sue for peace, and the Athenians rejected the terms. So, nevertheless, the Athenians, even though they won, lost several ships, and 6 generals, or admirals as we might call them, were brought up before the Athenian assembly on capital charges, death, for failing to rescue the soldiers who had fallen into the water. Although, as they claimed in their defense, a violent storm had prevented them from doing so. Contrary to Athenian law, the defendants were tried collectively, as a group, not individually. And furthermore, they were not granted a chance to speak in their own defense. Well, later, the Athenians regretted the decision to execute the men. In the course of the debate, according to Xenophon in the Hellenica, that's the sequel that I mentioned to Thucydides' history, a certain figure named Euryptolemus got up to speak as follows. I have come to the platform, men of Athens, partly to accuse Pericles, this is not the famous Pericles, another one, we'll come back to the famous one later, who was my kinsman and intimate, and Diomedon, who was my friend. So I'm going to get up there to accuse them, partly to speak in their defense, and partly to advise the measures which seem to me best for the state as a whole. And then he goes on to do that. Now, this is an extraordinary tactic. Why speak on both sides of the matter if the ultimate objective is simply to recommend that the generals be allowed to speak and that they be tried individually according to law? To be sure, it was not entirely unusual to rehearse arguments on two sides of a question. There was an orator named Xenophon who wrote little model exercises for the defense and for the plaintiffs and for the accused. There was a treatise called the Disoilogoi, the double arguments, which showed two sides of philosophical questions. Another example, one author, you remember that Odysseus won the arms of Achilles at the end of, and Ajax, who thought he deserved them, was so offended that he killed himself. this a guy named Antisthenes, who was the founder of the Cynic school and was also a disciple of Socrates, wrote a speech for one of them, and then he wrote a speech for the other one. So there was not so much of a irregular, but these were all school exercises. They weren't in a real assembly where a matter of life and death was at stake. So what motivated Euryptolemus to adopt such a strategy and Xenophon to give it such prominence in his narrative? It certainly wasn't to make Euryptolemus appear like an expert orator. No one wanted to be that. You want to look like a sincere person, not like a trained rhetorician. The purpose was rather, I believe, to show that he, the speaker, understood and could sympathize with the motives of parties on either side of the debate, and even put himself in their place. I can show you that I myself can speak against them. I can show you that I myself can speak for them. And that's what allows me now to give you good advice. Extremists find no common ground. And so genuine discussion and a meeting of minds are impossible. Whichever side wins, the other will not be reconciled. So discussion leads to, when they do factionalism, dissension, difference of opinion, leads to factionalism and ultimately to repression and civil war, as indeed occurred in Athens 2 years later. Euryptolemus' effort did not succeed, and I think this was a harbinger of the kind of civil conflict that was to come. But it was also, I think, offered as an example by Xenophon of how Athenians might have managed to preserve social harmony, even across profound differences of class and ideology. This was the vision that I hope to show that Xenophon derived from his experience of 2 civil wars in his own city and many others in other cities. So let me look at another case for a moment. This one is again from that Hellenica, the historical work, in which faction triumphs over conciliation. There's a character named Theramenes who was instrumental in persuading the Athenians to accept the harsh terms that the Spartans imposed after the war. It was when they won, they imposed harsh terms. Because the Athenians had lost all their allies and the city was being blockaded both by land and sea. So when Theramenes was sent to discuss terms with the Lacedaemonians, he deliberately dawdled with them for months. He didn't come back for months until he was sure that the famine in the city would eliminate any remaining opposition to the Spartans' demand that they destroy the long walls that connected the city with its port and also surrender their entire fleet. In other words, total surrender. And they were in a blockade. And Athenians were stubborn as can be. And he deliberately held out so that starvation would persuade them to agree. He was also one of the original 30 elite citizens who were chosen to draft a new constitution in the year 404, just right before the end of the war, to replace the radical democracy. In desperation, they elected a board of 30 citizens that could elect a non-democratic oligarchic group that would negotiate better with the Spartans. But the 30, as they came to be called, did something different. When they were appointed, they simply appointed a council of their own friends and filled all their other offices according to their own preferences. No constitutional system. And they embarked on a policy of eliminating any and all potential supporters of a democratic opposition. At first, Xenophon says, when they were eliminating others, they concentrated on well-known, they were called sycophants in those days. These were self-appointed denouncers of wrongdoing. And they enjoyed little favor among the populace at large. But they soon widened the net to include personal enemies, wealthy individuals whose property they wanted to expropriate, and anyone they imagined might be potential rivals, whatever their political affiliation. At this point, Theramenes began opposing their policies, and Critias, who was Plato's uncle and the fiercest member of the 30, charged Theramenes with treason, because Theramenes, one of the original founders of the group, was now saying they were acting too harshly. So he charged them with treason and urged that he be put to death. And what he did then was the council was going to put him to death. And so Critias hired a bunch of armed young men to stand guard and to ensure that the council gave their assent. In other words, he got it. It was a dangerous moment. But above all, Critias emphasized Theramenes' tergiversations. What I mean by that is that he kept changing sides to butter up whichever party seemed to be in the ascendant. And he said, this was what Critias said, this is why he is nicknamed the boot. It was a special kind of boot. For a boot seems to fit both feet. And so Theramenes looks from either side. So he was called the boot because it was a kind of boot that didn't distinguish. You could wear it on either foot. And so it could look at both sides. That's what he really didn't like. In his defense, Theramenes argued that it was Critias' harsh policies that were putting the regime in danger, not his ability to see different sides of the question, by alienating the majority of the citizens, including the best among them. Here we go. No, this seems going too far. 1 second. No, it's just not. This is some. Oh, you know what's happened? I'm sorry. Some slides haven't come through. It's jumped. Oh, no. I'm sorry. Some slides were missing.
This is the one that I put from your.
Yeah, I don't know what happened. It didn't jump through. It's okay. I'll just read it.
Okay.
It's not on this. Yeah. Well, it seems to be. 1 second. I don't understand this. It's there. It's just skipping when I can see it here.
You see it?
It's this one here, and it's jumping to this one.
The same one.
Oh, it's the same one. I see. Okay, I'm sorry. All right. Well, I'll just read it then. I'm sorry. My apologies. He says he calls me the boot because I try to fit both sides. But the man who pleases neither side, what on earth should we call him? And then he continues, but I, Critias, am always warring with men who do not think there can be a good democracy unless the slaves and those who would sell the state for a penny have a share. And I am always opposed to those who think that we cannot have a good oligarchy unless they secure that the city is ruled by only a very few. So he's saying, I'm opposed to extreme democracy, and I am opposed to extreme oligarchy. Even as he turns the tables on Critias, Theramenes does not reject the description of himself as looking both ways. He is equally at home with a moderate democracy and a moderate oligarchy. It's only when either violates its own principles that he begins to oppose them. And this is just what Critias has done in having him executed without respecting the oligarchy's own rules. As we shall see, this is a leitmotif in Xenophon's works. What's more, Xenophon provides, I believe, a theoretical justification for such a posture, relying at least in part on his conversations with Socrates. So let me then turn to the Memorabilia, or Reminiscences, a major collection of Socratic dialogues that Xenophon composed, and he also wrote an apology, like Plato, and a symposium, and other works that involve Socrates. In the fourth book of his Reminiscences, after Socrates has briefly complained about how difficult it is to find young people who are both willing and able to learn, he meets a young boy named Euthydemus, who is rather arrogant about his book learning. After bringing him down a peg by demonstrating how limited a basis for actual practice books alone supply, interesting point, Socrates discovers that Euthydemus hopes to go into politics as a career. At this point, Socrates inquires whether one can be good at politics without being just. When Euthydemus replies that justice is crucial, Socrates then asks whether he can distinguish between just and unjust actions. Euthydemus is confident that he can, so Socrates proposes that they make two lists, one labeled delta for dikaiosune, which is the Greek for justice, and the other alpha for injustice, adikia. And Socrates then asks Euthydemus in what column he would place actions such as lying, deception, wrongdoing, and enslavement. And Euthydemus immediately replies, they should go under injustice. This seems like a perfectly reasonable move, but Socrates shows that there are situations in which each of these behaviors could be justified. For example, enslaving the people of a hostile city is not unjust, nor is stealing and plundering their goods. Now, you might feel these are terrible examples of what's just, but, maybe we could offer confiscating the property and bank accounts of enemy states as a modern example. Is it just to confiscate the money in banks by our enemy states? We say it is. So I can't tell you that confiscating the money of people who have in good faith deposited in American banks or other funds is necessarily wrong. We do it, and we think it's right. So that would be a Socratic argument. Well, then Euthydemus says, okay, such acts are unjust, those things, when they're done against friends as opposed to enemies. Well, that sounds reasonable. But Socrates shows that lying to friends and allies may also be justified. For example, when a general is talking to his troops and they're discouraged, and he tells them help is on its way. And Xenophon does this in his own, as acting as general. He really does it himself. Or he says, I have a dream, and the dream tells me everything's going to be fine. Or a father deceives a child into taking medicine by telling him it's sweet. Or a friend takes a sword away from someone who might do himself harm. If I have a friend I'm afraid he might kill himself, I might take the sword away from him. It's stealing. In a way, it's his sword, but I would be doing worse if I let him have it. And this is an example that Plato uses in his own Republic, when he says, if somebody lends you a sword and in the meantime they go mad, and they ask for it back, it's not just to do it. So the upshot is that no given act is just in itself. Each depends on a wider context. Socrates then goes on to offer the same critique of any definition of what is good. That's getting worse here. As opposed to what's just. Health, wisdom, even happiness all turn out to be contingent and can be the cause of suffering. Here, I'll give you an example from Socrates. He says, let's say you're sick, and just because you're sick, you were going to go on a voyage, and you couldn't go. And the ship goes out and it sinks. Well, sickness was good for you in that occasion, and the guy who wasn't sick and healthy, he's the one who ended up drowning, or else he got COVID on a cruise. Then he says wisdom. Well, there were two famous wise men, Palamedes and Daedalus, who had mythic reputation. They were mythical figures for being wise. And the very fact led to their downfall. If I were to take a modern example, I could say that Einstein or Anthony Fauci has a greater chance of being kidnapped than I do. because somebody might want their wisdom, and sadly, they don't want mine yet. Okay. Even happiness, Socrates argues, is subject to the same ambivalence, since it depends on things like health and that are uncertain. And so Socrates raises doubts not only about our ability to emphasize, to identify what's just, but even what is good, a skeptical posture that has the effect of rendering people humble when it comes to politics. Because if you don't know, then you have to be very careful about what you're saying. You have to open yourself up to the possibility that someone else is right. I have a motto that I use for myself. If I enter into a quarrel with anyone, not a quarrel, but a discussion of politics, religion, whatever it is, I enter into it with the assumption, however remote it might be, that I might be convinced and not be the one who's convincing. Because if I don't, then I'm not having a conversation, I'm giving a lecture. I know what I think, and I want that person to believe what I believe. That's not a conversation. A conversation is where you're listening to someone, in which there's at least a chance, however much you don't like that person's position, that person might persuade you of something. That's how I like to enter, and that's what I'm claiming Socrates is doing here. Now, Euthydemus, as we saw, wants to be a statesman. And so Socrates proceeds to ask him that he knows what a democracy is, or more particularly, the meaning of the word demos, from which we get democracy, the power of the people. Euthydemus says that the people consists of the poorer class of citizens. That was the way it was understood then, a common meaning of the term. Socrates then asks, well, what do you mean by poor? And Euthydemus says the poor are those people who are unable to obtain what they need, and the rich have sufficient resources. So Socrates now says that many people who have only a little find that it's more than enough, whereas for some, like tyrants, no amount is sufficient. So on these grounds, tyrants who want everything and don't have enough, they would have to be included in the people. And those who have little, if they're economical, would be among the rich. See how you switch it around if you look at it that way? So on the surface, you could say this is one more tactic for making Euthydemus aware of how little he knows and rendering him susceptible to instruction. But if wealth and poverty are not determined by economic resources in the abstract, numerical, but are a function of your values and your outlook, a poor man is rich because he has enough. A rich man can be poor because he doesn't have enough. Then what the distinction between democracy and oligarchy, which was central to the politics of the city-states, is blurred or even eradicated. So you can see the implicit basis for an attitude such as that of Theramenes. If he is a boot, it's because there may not be a clear distinction between the left foot and the right, the rich and the poor, the members of the lower classes or the demos, and the wealthy supporters of the oligarchy. If that becomes blurred, well then, yes, one boot fits both feet. That's the argument I'm making by bringing these two sides of Xenophon's account into connection with each other. So was Socrates himself a just man? Since Xenophon's purpose in the reminiscences is to exonerate Socrates from the charges against him. Remember, he was convicted and executed for corrupting the youth. Well, then he certainly wanted to represent Socrates in a good light. In fact, according to Xenophon, Socrates manifested justice in his actions by treating everyone lawfully and helpfully, obeying the authorities, doing what the laws demanded, and by being disciplined in the city and while he was on campaign. Those are his virtues. Xenophon cites 3 instances in which Socrates obeyed the laws or disobeyed the laws despite the danger to himself, or he said actually obeyed them. First, when he was head of the assembly, he did not permit the people to vote contrary to the laws. And the reference is exactly to that trial of the generals that I just mentioned before. Now, how did he do that? When the matter was put to a vote, Socrates just happened to be president of the council. Now, the council was a group of 500 Athenians representing 50 each of the 10 voting tribes. That's not the assembly. The council is 500. The assembly was any Athenian citizen who turned up. They were all entitled to a vote. It was a direct democracy. But the council could set the agenda for the assembly. So what did Socrates do? He happened to be president, and the presidency rotated day by day. So what he said was he vetoed bringing that subject before the assembly on that day, and it had to be the next day. Second, Socrates disobeyed the 30 tyrants when they unlawfully forbade him to converse with the young. They told him he couldn't talk to any young person. And when they ordered him to fetch a citizen to be put to death, a point that Socrates also mentions in his Apology. Third, when he was on trial, he didn't ingratiate himself among the jurors, but preferred to die respectful of the laws than to live by transgressing them. In each of these cases, Socrates' action put him into conflict with the presiding authorities. First, it was the Democratic Assembly, then it was the 30 tyrants, then it was tradition and the laws. But the clear implication is that in each situation, there were laws that deserved to be obeyed, whether under the oligarchy, tyranny of the 30, or under the democracy. Socrates upheld the laws precisely in refusing to violate them. And so there were things he didn't do, although he was ordered to do them, because he believed that these were not consistent with the laws. In each case, the Athenians were acting contrary to their own laws in condemning a group of people collectively and not allowing them to speak. They were acting contrary to the tyrants were acting contrary to their principles by bringing innocent citizens and killing them. And these, whether it was the democracy or the oligarchic tyranny, Socrates knew when not to. Now, we might have expected some indication of an independent criterion by which to determine whether a law is just or unjust. How do you know? Why disobey these orders but not others? But as we have seen, Socrates has already cast doubt on the possibility of knowing whether any given action is just or unjust, and the same obtains for laws. A law that says one must repay one's debts would, if always observed and obeyed, entail that you should return a weapon to a friend, even though in the meantime he had lost his reason. Still, there must be laws, and in each case Socrates respected them by refusing to breach them, even when the party in power demanded it. So we don't know how to judge these laws, but Socrates does know that some individual consequences of them are things you shouldn't do. Xenophon then records a conversation between Socrates and the famous sophist Hippias, in which Hippias complains that Socrates never reveals his own views, but rather makes others look ridiculous by challenging those. If any of you has ever read a Platonic dialogue, you know that's how they work. So Socrates says, just as Xenophon had said, he responds by pointing to his actions, which he says are more credible than speech. He says, I've never borne false witness. I've never been a sycophant, accusing people. I've never led my country into civil war. Hippias isn't impressed, even when Socrates says that, and I quote, not wishing to commit an injustice is sufficient evidence of justice. You see how this relates to Socrates' posture? If I'm not willing to do something unjust, that shows that I'm just. That's just what Xenophon had said Socrates did. Finally, Socrates offers a definition, and this is interesting. He says, what is lawful is just. What is lawful is just. The two terms, he says, signify the same thing. Laws, he says, are what the citizens of a city agree upon and inscribe, indicating what one may and may not do. And the one who is lawful or law-abiding behaves according to the laws, whereas one who is lawless contravenes them. Because see how this is fitting into the picture that I'm trying to draw. Those who respect the laws perform just deeds, and one who does so is just, and so law-abiding. And that is just what a just person is. Now, this is an extraordinary claim. Law-abiding is the same as justice. Surely one would think that some laws, at least, are unjust or do more harm than good. If so, but this would require some criterion by which to judge them, and that's just what Socratic skepticism has undermined. Since, as he showed, any general definition of what is just or even what is good must fail to cover all cases. So he can't just say the law in the abstract is good or bad. The equation of justice with obedience to the law conforms perfectly to the way Xenophon argued that Socrates was the most just of men, precisely by refusing to contravene the laws. But it's not just this. In his previous conversation with Euthydemus, the young man, Socrates had argued, this time didactically. He actually says, Xenophon says, Socrates put away his cross-examination technique, and he spoke freely and gave a real discourse. And he says that he had argued that the order of the universe, the whole universe, is beneficial to human beings and a sign of the care that the gods have for us. So here he had made a claim about the cosmos. The universe is beneficial to human beings. He said, this is true even if a storm or drought might harm some people in one area and not another. And we know that. So how do you argue that the universe is just if it harms some people? Here, there's storms. Socrates doesn't appeal explicitly to justifications of the sort that if you could take the entire picture into account, then we would see that this is the best possible world and that natural disasters have their proper place. He doesn't say that. He doesn't say that's how it's working. Neither did he offer something like the Stoic idea. The Stoics said, yes, there is evil in the world, and it's necessary because if there were no evil, there could be nothing just. It would be as ridiculous as saying, I could have right without left. You can't have right without left. You can't have tall without short. These are complementary things. So if you can't, if good is like that, it depends on evil. If there were no evil, then you would have no good. That was one Stoic argument for evil in the world. But yet, Socrates argues something similar. And this is the laws are beneficial. The laws are beneficial not because any particular law will be just in every individual or helpful in every individual instance, but because the rule of law itself makes life possible. You must have laws because without them you can't have life. The cosmos is so organized that life for human beings is possible. Yes, in being so organized, things happen. I could make a defense. I could say, well, hurricanes wouldn't be dangerous if people were smart enough not to live in hurricane-prone areas. But we do. and we expand, and the world is fruitful, and things grow, and we expand. And so, yes, we'll encounter places which, when we go there, aren't maybe going to treat us beneficially in every moment. But if the world weren't so constructed that there were winds, that there were seas that could rise, that could fall, then if it didn't have that universal order, well, then life would become entirely impossible. And the same is true for laws. Now, of course, when laws are being enacted or reviewed, or as Socrates puts it, when the citizens of a city are in the process of agreeing to and inscribing the laws, people will have various views about which ones to support or reject. Whether or not you vote in favor of one or another piece of legislation, when it is passed, it's binding, an inseparable part of the law of the land. It is this commitment sanctified, as Socrates says, by an oath in all cities that promotes harmony at home and wards off enemies abroad. For it enables citizens to accept laws that are counter to their preferences and even their sense of justice, provided only that they were legitimately passed and supported. Socratic doubt thus becomes an instrument for promoting respect for the laws, whichever party is in power. In this way, it may work to reduce polarization of the sort that leads to civil war. It was just such a conception, I would argue, that at least implicitly informed the behavior of Euryptolemus and Theramenes, who looked both ways, as Critias put it so disparagingly. So I want to give you another example. Hope I'm doing well on time. In the first book of the Memorabilia, the Reminiscences, Xenophon describes Socrates' attitude toward the natural scientists of his time in terms that are reminiscent of his so-called autobiography in Plato's Dialogue de Phaedo. According to Xenophon, Socrates never discussed the nature of everything the way most of the others do, investigating how the cosmos, as the sophists call it, works and by what necessary laws each thing occurs in the heavens. Rather, he showed that those who worry about such things are acting like fools. And so, here I finally get to a slide that I didn't make a mistake on. First of all, Xenophon says he wondered whether they had sufficient knowledge of human affairs to proceed to such abstract matters, or whether they believed it was appropriate to neglect human matters in favor of the divine. Now, he was amazed, too, that it was not evident to them that it is impossible for human beings to discover such things. For even those who are proudest about speaking on these matters do not agree with one another in their opinions, but behave to one another like madmen. For some madmen do not even fear terrible things, while others are afraid even of things that are not frightening. You've seen that. Some are hyperphobic, some are hypophobic. Some think that it is not shameful to say or do anything in public, while others think they must not even go out of the house. They're so ashamed. Some honor neither temple nor altar nor anything else pertaining to the divine, while others worship stones and any pieces of wood or wild animals they chance upon. So too, among those who brood about the nature of everything, some believe that what exists is one single thing, while others think that things are infinite in number. Some believe that all things always move, others that nothing is ever moved. And some believe that everything comes into being and perishes, and others believe that nothing ever comes into being and perishes. And this actually describes some of the philosophers and their opinions. So Parmenides, nothing moves. You remember Zeno's paradoxes. Take an arrow. An arrow is flying through the air. But what about a given instant? Just one instant of time. Is the arrow moving in one single instant of time? No. In any instant of time, it's still. So if it's still at any instant of time, it's still at every instant of time, so it can't move. So that was the kind of arguments. Now, You might suppose that the criticism of the natural philosophers resides simply in their inability to come to any agreement, which shows that such studies are in vain. But the analogy with mad people who fear either everything or nothing, or those who feel no shame versus those who are so shy to the point of locking themselves away, to my mind suggests a different interpretation. The problem with the natural philosophers isn't so much that they differ in their views, but they maintain such extreme positions about the nature of things. That's the problem. Either everything moves or nothing. Either the cosmos is one or it's made of infinitely many things. When people insist on such monolithic positions, admitting of no exceptions, there is no way for them to engage in dialogue with each other or to come to a plausible account of nature. I would agree with a critic named Thomas Pangle that the folly of other philosophers in claiming to have achieved access to the truth is manifested in the crazily extreme opposition of their theoretical contentions. In both ordinary craziness and philosophical reasoning, Xenophon represents Socrates as endorsing a sane middle outlook. Some things are mortal. Others, gods for example, are immortal, and so they don't perish. Some things move, others do not. For Xenophon, the earth would be an example, something that doesn't move. It's just this kind of middle ground. Not everything moves, nothing moves, that I think Euryptolemus and Theramenes represent in the historical context. Neither side has a monopoly on justice or on the truth, and the proper stance is precisely to look both ways. The physical philosophers are not only like madmen, they are also like the extremist partisans of democracy or oligarchy who threaten to drive the state into civil war. That's the connection I'm making. We may return now to the topic of human laws, which Xenophon relates in the form of a dialogue between Alcibiades and his legal guardian, Pericles. Now, this is the real Pericles, the famous Pericles, and the very wild man Alcibiades, who at one point, when on campaign, was charged with violating religious laws back in Athens, and he went over to the Spartan side and betrayed the Athenian side, actively. So what kind of a character is this? Alcibiades asks Pericles to define what law is. You see where we are here. Pericles says that's easy. Laws are what the people meet, approve, and inscribe. We've already seen this. And they indicate what one should and shouldn't do. So Alcibiades asks then whether the laws prescribe good or bad things, and Pericles says, good things, of course, as though he knows what good things are. Alcibiades then introduces a clever distinction by inquiring about decisions that were taken and published not by the people, but by a few, the oligarchs. To which Pericles responds by saying, these too are laws. He then goes further, and he says that everything in the ruling party in a city deliberates upon and inscribes are called laws. Even if a tyrant rules a city, says Alcibiades, Pericles said, well, yeah, these too are laws. They're written, they're inscribed by the ruling authority. Alcibiades then says, what is violence and lawlessness? And he offers the definition that it occurs when the more powerful fail to persuade the less powerful. That's when it becomes violent, but they resort to compulsion. And when Pericles agrees, Alcibiades offers as an example of what a tyrant imposes on citizens without having persuaded them. At this, Pericles withdraws his earlier statement insofar as it included under the heading of laws what tyrants enacted without persuading the citizens. Now the trap is laid. You see where this is going? Alcibiades then says, what about oligarchies, which impose their decisions upon the majority by compulsion rather than persuasion? And Pericles, that good Democrat, says whatever someone compels another without persuasion, whether it's inscribed or not, is violence rather than laws. And then the clincher. Is it also violence, Alcibiades asks, when the entire people, and he means the majority of ordinary citizens, the democratic faction, is in power and imposes its will upon the wealthy without having convinced them in advance? Pericles is stumped. And he answers evasively. Here's what he says. I love this. You're going to like this. That when he was young, he was also sharp at such sophistry. So what does Alcibiades say? He says, I wish I had known you when you were young and sharp. Okay, now, critics have been puzzled by Xenophon's inclusion of this debate, which he might even have invented, in a work intended to justify Socrates in the eyes of his accusers. Alcibiades, that terrible enfant terrible among Socrates' disciples, is shown beating the most eminent representative of the Athenian democracy when he was at the height of his powers. Some have said Xenophon is simply inept. But Gabriel Danzig has suggested rather, and I think this is my next slide, if I'm not mistaken. Let me see if it is. Yeah. He suggested rather that there are grounds for arguing that Xenophon really accepts Alcibiades' critique of the law and rejects the use of coercion, even by the majority. Now, we can see that that might be the case. His dislike for coercive legislation can be found throughout. And you see it in the way Socrates doesn't like the coercive whether it's of the Democrats or of the oligarchy. While this line of argument denies the legitimacy of non-consensual legislation, we should note that it doesn't in itself require that citizens ignore or disobey the laws. Xenophon does not say that Socrates encouraged disobedience, but his arguments do imply that any obedience would have the character of voluntary submission. That's how Danzig looks at this case. I would suggest, however, that Socrates' own behavior, along with his insistence in his conversation with Hippias that obeying the law is equivalent to being just, point to a different solution to Alcibiades' puzzle. In democracies, the people decide collectively on the laws, although their number excludes slaves, as we've seen that was Rouman's view, that it's only extreme Democrats who would do that. Women, it excludes women. It excludes resident aliens. It excludes children, of course. They can't vote. In an oligarchy, it's a much smaller percentage, just the very wealthy. That doesn't include even all the citizens. But one must respect their rulings all the same. It's only when these parties contravene their own laws that it's possible or even obligatory to disobey, because now you're obeying the laws, but not those who violate their own laws. By starting with an example of the tyrant, Alcibiades was loading the dice. For tyrants, as Greeks thought of them, were not only generally unpopular, but they were also, in principle, illegitimate, since the term implied that they had usurped power. The 30, in their extremist phase, could rightly be regarded as tyrannical, as Critias himself said. When he said to Rouman, he said the following: if you think that just because we are 30 and not one, it is less necessary to manage our rule than if we were a tyranny, you are foolish. Tyranny may mean the rule of one, but we as an oligarchy have to behave tyrannically. If you don't realize that, you're a fool. This is what Critias says to Rhamines. Going close to time? 4 more minutes? Couple more minutes. Then I'm going to, I am right at a couple of more minutes. Luckily. Okay, after the battle between the Democratic Party and the oligarchs, because the Democrats drove the oligarchs out of power, in which Critias lost his life, during a truce, while the bodies of the fallen were returned and fighters from both sides were mingling, they were taking the bodies from both sides for burial, a herald on the Democratic side named Cleocritus called out to the enemy. And he said, fellow citizens, this is the Democrat talking to the oligarchs, why are you expelling us? Why do you wish to kill us? For we have never done you any harm, but we have shared with you in the most solemn rites and sacrifices and the finest festivals. We have danced together in choruses and gone to school together and have been comrades in arms. And we have risked many things with you in land and sea for the common safety and the freedom of both. Cleocritus accuses the 30 of bringing this hostility about, and yet he says his side, the Democrats, have wept as much over the lives that the oligarchs lost in this battle as they have over their own people. The division between the two parties is all arbitrary. We recall Socrates' demonstration that there is no clear way to distinguish the rich from the poor. It has been provoked by a cruel band that usurped power and did not fulfill the charge for which they were appointed. They were owed no obedience in this war. Any more, we may note that Socrates was obliged to listen to their orders. Cleocritus, like Theramenes, was able to sympathize with both sides, although his appeal was, like so many others, ineffective, and the fighting continued. So let me summarize in conclusion the argument I have presented, which has several moving parts. I have adduced the figure of Euryptolemus, who showed he could understand arguments on both sides before proposing simply that the Athenians follow their own laws. To him I have added Theramenes, who supported the moderate democracy and in turn the oligarchy of the 30 until they became openly tyrannical and served only their own interests, and for that reason he was dubbed a boot that could fit both feet. And finally Cleocritus, who insisted that both sides had common interests and that he could weep as much for the oligarchs who had been slain in battle as for those lost on his own side. What is more, I have suggested that Xenophon derived from his years with Socrates a critique of basic political concepts such as justice, good versus bad, and the distinction between rich and poor or oligarchy and democracy that should render people humble about their convictions. If one could confound such basic categories as just and unjust, popular and elite, then one might well be wrong, even about one's own beliefs. The answer to such doubts was to respect the law wherever laws were properly enacted, despite one's own partisan allegiances. When a given regime acted contrary to its laws, as when the assembly condemned the generals at Arginusi collectively and without letting them speak, or when the 30 intimidated the council into agreeing to the execution of Theramenes, although he was a citizen, then it was proper to defy their rulings. To stick to a rigid extremism was like an act of madness, or one of those natural philosophers who insisted on one and only one principle in their interpretation of the cosmos, either that it was one or many, or that it moved or didn't move. Might it be fair, then, to characterize Euryptolemus, Cleocritus, and maybe even Socrates himself as boots, as Critias did Theramenes? If so, and here's my final sentence, perhaps the lesson is that we need more boots on the ground. Thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Konstan. I think that we might have to have some of the current politicians read your work. So we have time for one or two quick questions, and then we have a presentation. Anyone have any questions? Well, I have a question. So one of the things that you were doing is reporting some speeches by Xenophon and others. There's always the question about whether or not they are legitimate, they're made up, invented. Can you speak a little bit about how trustworthy this guy is and whether or not these are artificially constructed arguments and thoughts?
Well, I think some of them may be Xenophon's invention. But that would strengthen my point. Because whether they were really delivered the way he says, or whether he twisted them a bit, edited them, he made them reflect a certain point of view. He was consistent in suggesting that there was a moderate position, that there was a way, and that you had achieved it by trying to understand both parties. And as an aid to this, in his representation of Socrates, he seems to go, I mean, if you want to show that Socrates was a good, honest man, he could never have corrupted the youth. Well, what you would probably do is say he sacrificed everywhere. And others say this, that's a claim they made. He respected the gods. He could be shown always to be offering virtuous positions. You don't go around saying that he showed a young man that you don't know what justice is. That he shows a young man you don't know what good and bad are. That he shows a young man, and after the democracy has taken power, that you don't know the difference between democracy and an oligarchy. Socrates is doing something for which he was considered to be undermining the very understanding of virtue, the very understanding of traditional values. That's what got him in trouble and got him killed. So why is Xenophon giving him this posture? It may be the way Socrates really was, and it may be some of the reason why it did get him killed. But for Xenophon, in his defense, I think what he is showing is that you should never be so arrogant as to think you're right about everything. You can't hold an extreme position. Yes, on the whole, it is just not to steal. But there are times when you don't give somebody back his property. Yes, on the whole, being healthy is good. But there are times when you're not healthy and it'll save your life. Yes, there are all these situations. So for laws too. Yes, there are times when laws run against some individual's interest. But it is important that there be laws. However, it is also important to engage in civil disobedience of a sort when the laws are improper by any standard, by the standards of the lawgivers themselves. And when that happens, then it enables and justifies a certain contrary action. So this is the complex view that he holds, and I think in inventing and creating this subversive Socrates, he's actually adopted a vision that will justify mutual understanding.
We have time for one more question.
Yes, here.
Would you speak into this, even though it doesn't do anything to...
Well, so it comes down to basically how Socrates is portrayed. In other words, the way Plato portrays Socrates is, in a sense, giving him we see why he would be controversial. Yeah. But Xenophon is presenting him as the moderate in all cases.
That's exactly what I think.
That's the way we have to look. I mean, if the Xenophontic Socrates is the real Socrates, then one of my professors once said, that meant he would never have been put to death.
I think, it's hard to say. I think we can read Xenophon's Socrates as potentially dangerous. He justifies the cosmic order. He says that we need a rule for law. He says obedience to the law is what justice is. But these aren't the kinds of arguments, the kind of representation of Socrates that would win him a lot of friends if he were brought up to trial. And Xenophon is puzzled by this. In Xenophon's apology, which he wrote for Socrates, he says, Socrates was the smartest, cleverest guy going. He can't have given such a bad speech that he would end up losing his life. So why did he do it? And you know what he says? He says he was 70 years old, and he knew that if he lived on, his eyesight would go, he'd start to drool, he'd get sick, he'd stumble along, and he'd be this pathetic figure that everyone would remember. Whereas, if he dies a martyr now, just as his life's at the turning point, well then, this is going to give him a reputation forever. And so he deliberately wrote a dumb speech, or not a dumb one, a provocative one, which guaranteed that he was going to get killed. This is Xenophon's understanding of him. So Xenophon doesn't really think that Socrates is such an amenable figure as all that. And maybe we should read some of that too in connection with the kind of argument I've been making.
So very, very much.
This
for
is lovely. Thank you. This will sit permanently on my desk.